All right, class, today we're talking about the settling of the West. We're going to discuss why people move west during the late 1800s and what are the factors that brought them to the West, what groups of people were moving west and why were they going. But what we want to start with today is a little short activity. And I want you to think about why do people move? And I'm not just necessarily talking about large groups of people. Like if you were to move houses or move to a different town, what causes people to move? What we want you to do is list 3 specific reasons, and then the video is going to stop here and give you a chance to type that in. What are 3 reasons that people move? Just go ahead and it'll stop here and you can type those in. One of the important things to remember, guys, is that as people move west, we've got all different types of groups going west, and sometimes these groups don't necessarily have the same goals or the same interests, the same culture. And so as they come out here onto the prairie, there's a lot of cultural clash and a lot of conflict that results from that. You, of course, have the cattle industry. You've got all those longhorns out there on the plains, and especially after the Civil War, that becomes an important thing to be able to get those cattle back east to feed all those hungry mouths back in the east. And so you've got ranchers and cowboys out there. And of course, for quite some time now, you've got the Native Americans that are out there on the plains. And as people begin to move west, the population of the Plains Indians, of course, declines. They're either moving or being killed by new settlers coming out. So you have those clashes that are beginning to develop. The Plains Indians are the ones that when you see a movie on TV or you see a picture or anything else, like that's who you're thinking of, is the Plains Indians. That's where we get most of our modern images of American Indians, where that comes from. So when we talk about the Plains Indians, that fits like all those stereotypes usually that you're used to. Certainly very distinctive, and this is a highly developed culture, regardless of what settlers that had moved west thought of them. There was a tremendous amount of pride in their culture and in their traditions, but they were a diverse group. In the East, you had primarily agricultural groups, whereas in the West, some of the different tribes, you had more nomadic, especially our Plains Indians are very nomadic, and they're hunters, and we know what they rely on for their source of hunting. In most cases, it's going to be the buffalo. Now, what we call the buffalo is actually the American bison. It's not actually really a buffalo, but that's primarily where they're getting a lot of their livelihood. And some of you have probably heard this before. The buffalo is so important to the Plains Indian because they use it for everything. It's not just, kill the buffalo, eat the meat, and then just leave the rest of the carcass there. They use the buffalo for everything, from the horns and the hooves to even the buffalo droppings they're going to use as a dry form of fuel to burn and to have fire. And there's so many different ways for tools and different things. So that is their livelihood. And so what you have is settlers coming from the east, utilizing modern technology, guns and everything else like that to absolutely decimate a population of the buffalo. And the buffalo is rapidly trying to escape, but they're getting killed off, and that is the livelihood for the American Indian. Now they're able to move around quickly, and they're benefited from the Spanish bringing in horses that allow them to hunt and get around and be a little bit more mobile. But even still, this pressure from settlers coming east and decimating this population of the buffalo, that leaves the American Indian in a very difficult position, a very difficult place as they try to adjust to these new cultures. So you probably already know a little bit from different things, movies and stuff like that, what the Native American family life looks like on the plains. They're generally in small, extended family groups. When you think about these little tribes or whatever, usually they're extended families. They're with their relatives in these small groups, these small like clan groups. Most of you probably also many of you probably also realize that they have very strong spiritual beliefs that are connected to nature, connected to the land. And so that guides a lot of what they do, everything from their hunting to their day-to-day life. And they pass on these cultural traditions through myths and games and all of these kinds of folkways that they have. One real important belief that they have that is perhaps going to be a difficult cause some difficult conflict is that they don't believe in specific personal land ownership. They believe that the land belonged to everyone to use responsibly and to respect that relationship with nature. They gave and they took what they needed, and then they gave back, and they tried to take care of nature in that way. And then all of us, this it's kind of like this land is your land, this land is my land kind of feel. That they wanted to take care of all of that so that everyone could use it, come and respect the land, which may or may not be exactly how some other cultures that are spilling onto the plains feel about that. So they definitely have their very distinctive culture from maybe the rest of what American settlers are practicing at this time. So that kind of gives this little question, this little thought, and I want you to consider this, and you can consider what you already know. You can consider some of the things that we've talked about already, but you know there's going to be conflict. You guys know that from just what you know about history. So I want you to share this. We're going to stop the video here, and it's going to give you a chance to respond to this question. I want you to describe one part of Native American culture, maybe that we've just discussed or that you already know, that you think was probably misunderstood by settlers and may have eventually resulted in some conflict. So what about this Native American culture that we've just discussed may have not really jived really well with what settlers coming west would have practiced, or what their culture would have been? So give one example of that here, and then as we type on, we're going to talk about some of those conflicts.
Okay, and as we continue, we want to see some of the factors that were pushing settlers westward. And again, geographically, we consider these push factors and pull factors, which we were discussing. First of all, several ideas that kind of guided this movement westward is that settlers could actually have a chance of owning land. Land ownership throughout European history had been very tenuous, and the wide open West, as they saw that, gave settlers the idea that they could actually go out and own land and control their own destiny. Others were lured by, quite obviously, silver and gold. As we see the gold rush up here in California, 1848, 1849, we're seeing a lot of motivation to come out and, like the old dream, to get rich quickly. And of course, as we'll see, a lot of these people did not experience that. Most miners pretty much went broke. Some actually lost their lives in the attempt with all the hardships moving westward. The only people that actually get rich from the gold rush, okay, and we'll discuss this in more detail later, are the people that supplied the miners, okay? So as they were moving into the West and establishing these mining camps, which sprung up literally overnight. If you visited the West, Colorado, Nevada, Wyoming, you do see remnants of ghost towns, which were actual mining towns. But pretty quickly, all the amenities that typically men needed, like saloons, various red light districts, they appeared pretty quickly. So these places were, to say the least, pretty lawless at first. Not until the influx of settlers, and namely women settlers, did these places actually sort of, as we say, tame down, and that in some places actual civic development takes place. So as we can see, here are two very powerful motivations for American settlers to take over native lands. As settlers move westward, this again puts more pressure on Native American groups, so much so that the United States government is starting to put restrictions on where they can actually reside. So by 1834, the reservation system is taking shape, and pretty much the area which we call the Great Plains is one large reservation. Various ethnic tribes are assigned to different regions. And by 1850, more formal boundaries are established for tribes, most notably the Sioux in the Dakota regions, of course in Texas, the Cheyenne and the Comanche. Now, as we go along, we see conflict becoming more and more prevalent. Some of the major points here, some of the major battles I'll touch on, but do be aware that many nameless battles occurred all over the place. So the high points we'll touch here. One here is the Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. As usual, Cheyenne were trying to leave the reservation in order to carry on their way of life and mainly to stay alive through hunting. Rations on reservations were quite dismal, so many would have to leave the reservation in order to supplement their diet through traditional hunting. So, when this would happen, the Army would typically be tasked with going out and rounding up these individuals and bringing them back to the reservation where they could remain under government control. And again, a famous quote, General Curtis, who was sent out to get these people, I want no peace until the Indians suffer more. So this is an incident where the Army came upon the Sand Creek encampment and pretty much opened fire. This is in southeastern Colorado. And over 500 men, women, and children were pretty much killed from a sneak attack on their camp. Now, continuing with our discussion on the Indians, we do need to look at some of the major transportation routes that were blazed through the West. Of course, the Oregon Trail is very famous, especially when you were in elementary school with a game of same name. The Bozeman Trail, again, is one of the earliest ones here. We see 1863 through 68. It's going through primarily the Dakotas, Montana, and the Wyoming region. And of course, this is uh, one of the major victories that the Native Americans actually achieved was stopping settlement along the Bozeman Trail. Sioux Chief Red Cloud, in an effort to stop the transit of settlers through this region, effectively waged a successful campaign against the U.S. Army. This was called Red Cloud's War in 1866. So not only did it mark a victory for Native Americans, it did cease, at least for a while, major traffic and settlement patterns on the Bozeman Trail. So the government pretty much had to acquiesce or give in to Red Cloud at least for several years. Now let's quickly discuss some of the treaties that we see between settlers and Native Americans. One of note is the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1851. And again, this sets a series of agreements where the U.S. government will agree to certain terms with Native American tribes, usually piecemeal, individually, but later go back on their promises and again, basically take Indian land. So on this one, again, it sets the pattern for future treaties. The Sioux did agree to go to the reservation and basically be wards of the state. Uh, Chief Sitting Bull never signed this. And of course, this will set up events later in the 1870s, most notably at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Sitting Bull will actually defeat the U.S. Army forces under General George Armstrong Custer. Now, let's talk quickly in more detail about the gold rush that we had mentioned earlier. Uh, do note that as settlers were moving west, the Pikes Peak region became one of the first areas to become widely known for gold. Again, Zebulon Pike in his explorations of the region in the 1840s, and whom Pikes Peak is obviously named after, noted that there were gold deposits in the region, and by 1858, Colorado was experiencing a gold rush. Again, we see the same thing in the Black Hills of South Dakota by 1874. And of course, this is smack dab in the middle of the tribal lands of the Lakota Sioux, which of course, this caused a rebellion. If you remember earlier, the Treaty of Fort Laramie said that the Sioux would have their lands in perpetuity. Well, that was until gold settlers jumped the claim and started invading their lands. And of course, the government was really lax about doing anything effective on this, which further increased tensions between the Sioux and the United States government. Now, considering what we've talked about in our discussion today, I would like you to take this time to pause and describe one part of Native American culture that was misunderstood by U.S. settlers. Now, we've been looking at conflict building over a period of 30 years at least, from the 1850s, and as gold is discovered, there's more settlement pressure on the West. One of the most notable and widely publicized at the time conflicts between settlers and the Native Americans was what became known as Custer's Last Stand. This is a military maneuver performed by General George Armstrong Custer. He was seen during the Civil War as a rising star, a boy general, if you will. And after the war, Again, as the Army was paring down in personnel, he was taken down a few steps in rank, but still was called a general and was looking to kind of recapture glory that he had seen during the Civil War. So in June of 1876, as the Sioux had left the reservation, he, as part of a larger formation, were operating in the area of southeastern Montana and Wyoming in order to bring Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux back into the fold. So, as it happened in the late June of 1876, Custer was one of three elements which of the main army were divided off, and his element did make contact with Sitting Bull Sioux and also a large part of the Cheyenne Nation. Crazy Horse of the Cheyenne and, of course, Sitting Bull of the Sioux were seen as tactical geniuses for their time. Just the fact that an army did not have European-style equipment did not mean that they were not tactically adept. And one quick note on that, most historians now agree that the Native American forces at what became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, June of 1876, were actually better equipped than the Union Army, the federal forces that were opposing them. Through trade of gun dealers and back channel dealing, the Indians were able to gain a lot of military equipment that made them very effective on the battlefield. So, long story short, Custer is surrounded. He becomes detached from the main part of his army. And after an immediate attack and a later 2-day siege, his forces are forced to withdraw, the bulk of them being killed at Little Bighorn. Now that we've discussed how Native Americans and American settlers were clashing out on the plains, let's look at some larger ideas that are associated with this. First of all, let's look at the idea of assimilation. Basically, assimilation in this case is where Native Americans were forced to give up their way of life, which is largely nomadic and pastoral, meaning they hunted and gathered, to basically take on white culture, okay, European American culture. Now, several things were instituted by the government in order to facilitate this. Most notably was the Dawes Act, 1887. The idea was to kind of abandon the reservation system which existed to that time and ideally make the Indians farmers, just like their white settler counterparts. So the idea was the Dawes Act would give Native American families 160 acres each per person in order to establish a farm using Western agricultural methods. Ideally, implements would have been provided, training, seeds, everything needed to make an agricultural transition possible. Okay, the rest of the land that the government had allocated towards reservations was to be leased to settlers, which of course they would implement European farming methods that way. Now, the profits from these farms, again, were going to be the thing that drove the purchase of farm implements. Okay, so as this program was implemented, pretty much there were some limited successes, but overall the program really was not effective in changing the way of life for many Native Americans. So what we're looking at here is overall you could say it was a failure. And by 1932, over 2/3 of the territory previously controlled by Native Americans were owned by whites. So definitely over the long haul, the Dawes Act would be considered ineffectual. Now let's pause and reflect on what we've discussed so far. In your own words, what does assimilation mean to you?
The destruction of the buffalo is definitely a huge thing that happened during this time. In 1800, there were 65 million buffalo that roamed the Great Plains, but by 1890, only 1,000 remained. So the white settlers absolutely decimated this buffalo population. And this naturally caused hardships for the Plains Indians, given that the Plains Indians used the buffalo for everything, for tools, for meat, droppings for fuel, hides for clothing and leather. So this absolutely wreaked havoc on their way of life.
A lot of this disagreement culminates in what is known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. It's kind of like the last straw for Native Americans. So we had talked about so much battles back and forth and so, this resistance that's going on. And the Battle of Wounded Knee, which you might have heard of before, is kind of the place where it's sort of, I don't know if I want to say that it ends, but the resistance ends on the part of Native Americans. This happens in December of 1890, and this was a planned relocation of an American Indian tribe, where the army was basically supposed to be escorting them in a particular direction. They confiscated the weapons of that Native American group, or supposedly had, and as they were in the process of doing so, a shot rings out. It happens like so many times in American history, right? A shot rings out, nobody knows where it comes from, right? But in this case, that happens, and as soon as that occurs, the army begins to absolutely slaughter this Native American group, most of which were unarmed, many of which were women and children, and were basically defenseless in this way. And this slaughter almost acts as a signal to most Native American groups. They had resisted for so long. Obviously, the United States was not going to play fair, and no matter what the U.S. had promised Native American groups, they probably were not going to fulfill those promises. And realizing that the preservation of their people was more important than trying to save the land that they were on, this kind of marks the end of Native American resistance. And really, at this point, they basically say, "Okay, fine, America, tell us where to go, tell us onto what reservation we'll just go. We're just trying to preserve our own people at this point." And so it kind of ends armed resistance. There will still be scuffles, definitely, that occur here and there, but by and large, the Battle of Wounded Knee sort of ends those Indian wars because Indians realize they don't stand much of a chance trying to resist against the United States, which isn't using much discernment or even fair policy when it comes to regulating these things. And that's going to bring us to another group that's out there in the West that we kind of hinted at earlier, but didn't really talk about as much at the time. And that has to do with the cattle business. We've got all those longhorns out there on the range, and this desire and this demand for beef in the East. But we need a way to get it there. We've got a number of railroad spurs that kind of come into the West, but not exactly where all the cattle are. And so there becomes a need for what we know as cowboys, who are going to be the ones responsible for getting that cattle to the end of the railroad spur and onto those train cars moving all the way back to the east. A lot of what we know, however, we got all these westerns, you got all these TV images and all that kind of stuff about the cowboy. And so we think we know a lot about cowboys. Some of us listen to country music, so we assume that we know a lot about cowboys and all those kind of things, but do we really? We're going to go through a little activity here called Cowboy Fact or Fiction. I'm going to ask you a couple true or false questions here on the stop here. And I want you to do your best. Do what you think. If you think that what you're reading is a true fact about cowboys, and you think that's true, you're going to mark true. If you think it's false, it's false. It doesn't necessarily matter if you get it right now. We're just kind of seeing what you think you know, or what we think we know about cowboys. So we're going to pause it here and give you a chance to do that. Okay, so how did you do? It's really interesting. A lot of things we think we know from culture and everything else like that are not true. So the first one, most of the cowboy food, clothing, terminology, and culture comes from Mexico. That's actually true. A lot of that is borrowed. You hear a lot of words like ranch comes from ranchero and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of that culture is borrowed from vaqueros, which is right there. You can see that on the slide. Okay. Second one, after the roundup, cowboys would feed cattle as much as possible to fatten them up before taking the long drive. You think that would make sense, but that's actually false. They wanted them very, very hungry on the long drive, because a hungry cow, as soon as they stop driving, the first thing that they do is they lean down and they start chewing some grass. So a hungry longhorn is the one you want out there on the range so that they don't run off. Another interesting one, and you kind of saw some of the answers on several of them. One of my favorite ones is cattle were often lost at river crossings because they would get swept away by the current and float down the river. You're like, that's ridiculous, right? It's actually true. Okay, so they did these dangerous river crossings, and if they cattle got spooked as they were crossing through the river, they pick up their feet and there they go, milkshake down the river. So a lot of sometimes what we think we know about the cowboys are some of the cultural trends that have been perpetuated over time. It's just not true. It was long days. It was hard work. Most cowboys had to give up and retire and find something else by an age that's probably younger than Mr. Scheer, because it was just such a grueling job. And they only work a few months out of the year. Of course, once those winter months start to come in, it's not really feasible to drive the cattle across there. So they're only working a few months out of the year. So a lot of the cowboy life and some of the romanticism, the bandits and all that kind of stuff really isn't true. Their job is to get those longhorns to the end of the railroad spur and feed that demand for beef in the east. And so this creates all along the long drive and all these places throughout the west, these cow towns, and helps with the settlement of the west. The business of driving cattle east spurs these little pop-up towns all over the west and starts that increasing that settlement. However, the era of the cowboy, you'd think like from American history, like cowboys, yeah, that's like everything that's America. It really wasn't that long of a time period. This open range, this land in which they grazed the cattle on, eventually there's only so much for them to graze on, so it gets overgrazed, and they of course faced extreme weather conditions. You know that because we live in some of the places that these longhorns would be. You go north a couple miles from here, you know some of the extreme weather that we get right on that border, the Oklahoma border, some of the tornadoes, some of the heavy winters that they have just north of here, or the extreme heat that we're in. So that kind of is a factor that limits what happens here with the cattle drive. Probably more important than anything is the invention of barbed wire. The open range was open. It couldn't really be fenced in very easily and the land privatized very conveniently. But with the invention of barbed wire, which can just be kind of rolled off a spool and hung up there relatively quickly and easily and manufactured relatively cheaply, that made it possible to section off this land. And I don't know if you have much experience with cows, but they can't jump over fences quite so easily and just hop over fences. So that sort of sectioned off that land and made this long drive to the end of the railroad spurs pretty much impossible as that land began to be privatized and sectioned off. So the era of the cowboy is relatively short-lived in that way. And of course, also the demand for beef in the east is going to kind of level off a little bit after some time as well. And so we think that, the cowboys are everything about American history in the West and things like that, but it was really a relatively short-lived era. So to finish off with today and to give you the chance to kind of interact with this, one of the main themes that we looked at today was conflict with the Native Americans. And certainly that does mark a big part of the history of the West. So what we're going to do is a little activity that's going to allow you to sort of trace through that a little bit. You're going to use either your online textbook or your print copy of the textbook. And what I want you to do is, in this section, you're going to find or identify 5 conflicts or battles between the Native Americans and the U.S. settlers. For each of these conflicts or battles, I want you to determine a couple things. What year did it occur? What was the conflict about? And who, and this is in quotation marks, won? Was it the Indians or the settlers? Okay. And again, this might be an opinion, or there might be some interpretation. So for each one, you've got the event, you got the date, what was it about, and who won. And you're going to construct a timeline. This says in your notebook, what we're actually going to do, we've created kind of a Google Doc here where you're going to plug those events in there, and you'll see the timelines already constructed in there, and it's listed under our assignments for the day. You can kind of plug those events in there and type in the box what was the date and everything else like that. And then you're going to do that for 5 events. If you have trouble finding it on the book or in the book or anything else like that, of course, you have a vast library of resources online to find some of those Native American events in the late 1800s, and just plug them in with each one of those details. And when you've got that finished, you can click that turn in button on the right side, and you'll have your assignment submitted. So that should help you kind of bring that all back together.